Alright, so today I just want to go through some basic ways of going from a model in VRED. So we've come from Fusion, we've put into VRED, we've textured it up, and now we want to make like an animation and export it as a video. So there's a few ways we could do this. The most basic way is to create an animation, and then when we render out our our animation, we save it as a video. However, that generally doesn't come out too well. So what we're going to look at is rendering it in a way where it saves out every single frame. We then move that across to Adobe Premiere Pro, sort out a couple things in that, and that allows us to export it from there as a video with whatever options we want. It's also going to give us control of putting text on the screen or anything like that. So annotations can be done really well through there. So we're going to go through a little bit of a different way of setting up animations here. So what I've just got is the scene. I'm actually going to render this on a blank background. So it's going to be like a PNG image where the background will be invisible. And to do that, you just have to make sure under your studio material or whatever environment you're using. So there's the environment as a whole, or the studio. On either one of these, you just want to make sure where it says is visible is unchecked. That means it won't actually render it out, but it still keeps all the same lighting on your object. So once we've got that set, we need to make our object move around. So we select it. Again, always have boundings turned on. It's really easy to see what you've actually got selected. And for this, maybe I just want to do something simple like have it rotate. So let's translate. Have it rotate around its base, if I can find the right one. So something like that would work pretty well. So we're going to play around with our curves. Like we did in our class tutorial the other day. So we have to make sure our timeline's open down the bottom. So we can just go timeline, make sure it's there. And we want to open up curves. So we click that, and if it opens it on the right screen, then we've got it here. We then just have to select our sort of file or folder that has all the things we want to rotate in it. And then it's a matter of setting, its rotation in the Z-axis. So we can go rotation Z at frame 0, which we're at here. We can key selected channel, so we're only selecting Z. And then whatever frame we want to move it to, we can just key it again straight away. And here we can directly input whatever value we want. So this is a good point to talk about sort of frame rates and on what frame to put different changes and how long you want your scene to go for. Generally, you'll use a 24 or 25 FPS sort of playback. 25 works because it's a bit easier to multiply. So we can just go base 25 for everything. And we just go OK. So that means if we make this, we change the value here to 100. That means in 2 seconds time, whatever this is will complete. And I need to hit enter there. So I hit enter there, it moves to frame 100. And if I make the value 360, that means it's going to do a full rotation. The problem is with our timeline, the way we've got it set, is it only goes up to 24. So you can change this by dragging this all the way across and changing the end value for the full timeline. So I'm just going to change that to 100, change the preview to 100 as well, and just hit play there. And that's going to do one full rotation. Now we know because there's 100 frames in that how many seconds did I say? That 4 seconds. The math is tricky. If we do that, that means it's going to render out 100 individual frames that it's got to calculate that and it's got to render it out. So it can take some time. As it is right now, it's not going to take a long time to do without ray tracing or anything. But once we turn on ray tracing and anti-aliasing, we get an improved quality. But calculating shadow, all these kinds of things, this is lagging significantly, and obviously the quality level isn't there. So this is where we can do those things of calculating shadow and baking our shadow and lighting. Just as a refresher, the way we can do that is by selecting our object here, going across to scene and bake light and shadows. So that opens up this. What we want to do is just make sure we're only calculating ambient occlusion. Shadows and lights, when selected, if the object isn't properly mapped out with UV textures and all that, it can get a bit weird. So we just want to see, I think, it doesn't have any shadows calculated on it. So if I just hit calculate, what that's going to do is calculate areas where there isn't any natural light, and that should give us a bit of sort of dimensionality to what we're looking at. And once that finishes up, we should see some darker areas. Yeah, so it's now shaded the object. The bottom base is dark because obviously there's no light there. It's a bit darker here, and these areas in here are a little bit darker, which is pretty much exactly what we want. So the beauty of that is baked onto the object. If we go to view and visualization, and go ambient occlusion rendering, it's going to show us where it's actually done that. And we can see we've actually got what looks to be like a few errors here on this surface. Sometimes that's just a clipping issue, but this is all the lighting that it's calculated, and I've lost it. Where is it gone? There it is. Okay, so that's just clipping into the floor. What I'm actually going to do is turn off the shadow plane, so we don't want to even cast a shadow. And then this is our clipping thing that happens when you reset the camera sometimes. We can just fix that by going to camera, perspective, because that's the camera we're using right now, clipping, and just hit calculate, and it calculates clipping based on where you are. You can always just change this to like 1, and then you shouldn't have that issue for a while. You can get really close when you zoom in on little details. So we can then go and see that there's an error with our ambient occlusion. We can see that there is no texture here. There should be a slight carbony texture on that. It may not come through on the recording too well. So what we can actually do is individually select objects and calculate lighting for them. So what I've done is selected this in a speaker material, and I'm just going to see if calculating the ambient occlusion at a higher setting will fix up some of these issues. So we just open that up again, and we can turn on subdivision. That's going to break up the surface into a smaller one. Okay, we can see it's fixing up some. It's probably got to do with the fact that it's clipping into the surface below it. We can go a higher quality. Yeah, okay, so going at a higher quality seems to have fixed it. Now this is really smooth and nice. Alright, so that worked out relatively well. Sometimes it doesn't always work exactly how you want it, and you have to play around with some of these settings, or maybe reposition the object slightly off. For something like that, shading that inner surface, it's all pretty even, so you could just literally make the material darker. So, we're not doing all this to become absolute experts at VRED. We just want to get whatever we can out of VRED so our renders look really well, or really good. Okay, we can say we're pretty happy with that. It looks good. We want to turn off boundings because that does show up in the render if you have it turned on. When we hit play, it's going to rotate around quite smoothly. One full rotation is all you really need, because then you can just repeat the animation in Premiere. We can play around with our camera settings if we want, so depth of field has to render out properly as well, but things like focal length to get make it look a bit more impactful, especially as it rotates around. That's really all up to you and your artistic style, I guess, at this point. So moving on to actually rendering this animation out, one thing we want to make sure of is that we're not clipping through any areas where it'll render. So we can do that by coming across to render, changing our image size presets. I'm just going to go 1920 by 1080. And if we come across to display output, we can turn on what's called a snapshot frame. And I also like to turn on this rule of thirds as well. And what this is going to do is show us now these outlines on our screen. And this is what this area is what's going to be rendered out. So we can see we're not clipping through anything. We are getting a bit close on the top. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit. You know, it might be the case that this is just part of a screen and there's going to be some text down the side here detailing what's happening. But for now, we just want to make sure every part of this is actually within the frame. That's fine. Doesn't really matter. Again, this is just for showing off the actual process. So once we're happy with that, we can come across to render. We can go down to animation. And if we turn that on, we get the option of going timeline or clip. This is really useful when setting up scenes with a lot of complicated elements to them. So if you've got a lot of animations going, you might not want it running all off the timeline. So what you can actually do is come across to our curves. We can select this now, which is just, you know, running our animation. And we can actually, if I can find the button for it, create an animation block element. I think that's what that says. So when we click that, it gives us this. And then we can come across to what's called clips. And this is where we can drag that. Oh, where is it? Oh, we have to make a new clip and drag that into there. So I don't know why it says motion blur. Let's just turn that off. But that allows us to have this in sort of like assembly of animations. So we can have this here. We can then make another thing of having the lighting in the environment change. And we can actually play around where they start and stop. So if we have the environment changing from the start on the second track, we can then maybe offset it a bit. So then the lighting changes once this gets part way through its rotation or something like that. I think I might go into that more in depth on another tutorial. But that doesn't really matter too much because what we can do now is instead of playing around with rendering timeline stuff, we can just render the actual clip. And what that's going to do is just render everything in this clip. So as a format, we can go movie, but again, this sometimes has a lot of issues. So we can just go use clip range, frame step 1. That means it's going to render one frame, then the next frame, then the one after it. If you put up the frame step, it'll skip a frame in between them. Obviously, you don't want to do that in just about every scenario. So after that's set, we've hit render animation. We want to export alpha channel. That's going to ensure that our background isn't rendered. We're rendering at HD. I might actually drop the resolution because this could take a little bit, but it shouldn't really matter too much. So we hit render. We just make sure we've got a folder for it, and we can just call this spin animation. And we hit OK. Now that's going to render every single frame out. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this recording and come back to you when this is all rendered out. Alright, so our rendering's done, the render window closed up. What we can do now is open up and find our files. So if we come across to this folder, we've got from 0 all the way up to 100. And the quality of each one's pretty good. So being 1920 by 1080, it's full HD. We can zoom in and, obviously we can see it starts to get a bit blurry. But once we start blending them all together, it's going to look pretty good. And we can see that it's got that sort of grey background from Windows, which means there's no background on it. This can be really good when you're actually setting up a background to render onto things. But for now, that's fine. What we want to do then is open up our Adobe Premiere Pro. You should be able to get this as a student, if not a trial version also works. And I'm just going to close down VRED just because it does use a bit of processing power. So from here, we just want to go new project. Sure, this all seems fine. We'll just name the project as Droid Spinning. Hit OK. Let it do its thing. Which it seems to have a bit of problem doing. There we go. Alright, so your workspace might be a bit different. You can just go to one of the default settings. Not really sure why this is operating so slowly at the moment. I generally don't have this problem with InDesign. With Premiere Pro. Okay, so that's fine. What we want to do now is where we've got media to start, we open, oh, that's the wrong button. We import, we right click and go import, and we come to our folder, which I made Droid Render. Now, when we select one of these, we get the option to import an image sequence. This is the important one. So when you've got this selected, it's going to bring in every single one of these as a sequence. And when it does that, we can see here it's got it going for 4 seconds, 0.1 or whatever like that. So all we have to do is bring it into our timeline. And when we hit play on that, or let's just double check the properties. So when it comes in, it is at 25 FPS, which is exactly what we want. It may be like 1 frame off, which is fine. And where is my play button? Okay, so the play button's there now. For some reason it wasn't there a second ago. But when we hit play, it should play, but it's not. When we step forward, it all looks fine. Okay, so there we go. There it's playing. I guess I'm just having some really weird... Okay, so we've got to make sure we're in the program, not the animation. Sometimes it doesn't work, but there it goes. Okay, so it might have to do with the rendering. Let's have a look at our whole scene. Nope, I honestly am not sure why it's not rendering it super smoothly. We can see some sections are working fine. But it's getting a bit weird. So let's just try and export it and see what happens. So if we go File, Export, Media, it's going to bring up our export window. I'm just going to go and check what else is running on this computer that is causing it to go so slowly. Apparently nothing. So I have had this later version of Premiere, seems to have a few issues here and there with maybe like memory leaks or something. Maybe it just doesn't like my laptop. But as we can see in the preview, it is rendering it how we want it. Not a problem. Generally, when we're exporting it, we want to go for something which is like, yeah, H.264. We can match the bitrate or go to something else. And we just want to keep an eye out on that estimated file size. So it should only be a couple megabytes. We obviously don't need any audio. That's fine. If we turn on use previews, it'll use the previews, making rendering faster. And we just want to make sure that the output is going to somewhere we want it, like our render video. And we just hit export. So that'll take a second, and then export it as an MP4. So obviously MP4 is pretty useful. It's compatible with everything. In the Premiere scene, that's where we would add in like a background or some extra text, which we'll go onto when we do some more advanced sort of renderings. Just because we're using PNG images, there's no background rendered on them, so we can make it appear over a scene or something like that. So that exported, let's have a look. We've got spin animation MP4, it's 3 meg, and there we can see it's playing quite smoothly as it rotates around. So again, just relatively short tutorial, not without its problems as it seems. But this is generally how I go about it. You can do, batch things in Photoshop, so you can run a batch on all of the images to adjust the levels and things like that. If you've got a preset amount you want everything to adjust to, or you could even adjust the levels when you come into, when you do it in Premiere, or we could do, so, we can come and play around with the levels, which I'll probably do a whole nother video on as well, just because we can play around with, if I go, like, if you want to make it darker or brighter overall, you can do things like that. I generally prefer to do bits and pieces in Photoshop just because you have more control, but by doing it in Premiere, you can get some really quick adjustments going. So if the color looks a little bit too red or all these kinds of things, you can tone it down or whatever that might be. But generally we won't have to do that because we've played around with it enough in VRED and Photoshop between them. But anyway, before I ramble on much longer, that's just a basic introduction of how to go from a setup scene in VRED, throw some sort of animation on it, export it as a bunch of images, and then render it up as a video. So thanks for watching.